interested in rebuilding relations with Canada, and if so, how?
No, well, I think we're going to have a great relationship. He called me up yesterday. He said, "Let's make a deal." You know, he was running for office. They both hated Trump, and it was the one that hated Trump, I think, the least that won. I actually think the conservative hated me much more than the so-called liberal. He's a pretty liberal guy. But no, I spoke to him yesterday. Couldn't have been nicer, and I congratulated him. You know, it was a very mixed signal because it's almost even, which makes it very complicated for the country. It's a pretty tight race, but he's a very nice gentleman, and he's going to come to the White House very shortly, within the next week or less.
That, of course, was Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, explaining, or at least telling everybody how much he loves Mark Carney. And we're going to get into that with my guest today, Tristin Hopper of First Reading. He's the editor of First Reading and a National Post columnist. But before we do, I think the news of the day has got to be Pierre Poilievre has found a seat, at least to run in. Couldn't be safer. And it's quite funny because I used to know Kevin Sorensen, who this seat was basically used to be called Crowfoot. Now it's Battle River Crowfoot. And this is quite interesting because we have a seat here that brings Pierre Poilievre back to his just outside of Calgary roots, anyway, his Alberta roots. So he's Alberta bound. And Damien Couric says he's not going to stay outside of politics. He'll be back in the next election. This is a temporary thing. But I do find it fascinating because Pierre Poilievre is going to be there in Alberta when this province is having a very, very, very visceral debate about whether or not it wants independence because of the election of Mark Carney. So he's going to be right in the crosshairs. And of course, Pierre Poilievre is not going to be supporting the separatists. He's not going to be saying anything nice about the separatists, but yet they're a growing force in the province. I think the idea, too, that the People's Party of Canada has decided they're going to run a candidate is absolute insanity, even if this is one of the safest seats in the country, and it is. You know, it's not uncommon for MPs in this area to win with 70% of the vote. However, anyway, we'll get into that another time. Without further ado, I want to welcome Tristin Hopper. You are the editor of First Reading, National Post columnist. Welcome to Stand on Guard. It's so nice to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So before we get into your book, I wanted to discuss an article that you've recently written where you say Donald Trump helped elect Mark Carney. And I don't think there's any question about that. It's the fact that Donald Trump is acknowledging that. And the clip we showed at the beginning, Donald Trump is very happy about the fact that his intervention, his interference, and I have to call it that, as much as I like Donald Trump, I was furious at the way he interfered in the Canadian election 3 times. And now he's bragging about how he helped elect Mark Carney. But the funny thing is, how do you explain, Tristin, that we've got the irony here of Donald Trump saying it's a great thing I elected Mark Carney, and all of these Democratic supporting media saying the same thing? Do you find that odd?
Not so much. I'd find I just did a review of sort of voices and politicians within the U.S. and it's generally agreed in the U.S. This is one of the first elections we've had that Americans have actually paid attention to because of the Trump element. As you mentioned, left-aligned media is like, yeah, Trump got Carney elected, hooray! And then, right-wing media and right-wing politicians, with some exceptions, characterize this as potentially a foreign policy failure of Trump, in that his actions directly led to the election of a government that may not be as aligned with U.S. interests as a liberal government would be. As to why this happened, I mean, you could point to this is, some four-dimensional strategic move in that a liberal government is less likely to build pipelines unless we continue to sell discounted oil to the United States. And, you can make that argument that this is, a strategic benefit to the Trump administration. But I think, like a lot of things Trump does, it probably just comes down to the fact that he didn't particularly like Pierre Poilievre for one reason or another, and took pleasure in screwing him over.
Well, apparently, Donald Trump Jr. wanted to meet with Pierre Poilievre. I've read this recently, and somebody in the Poilievre campaign kiboshed it. And I think, knowing as much as I do about Donald Trump, I think this probably put him over the edge, because he doesn't like to be slighted. He doesn't like family members to be slighted. And the fact that the Poilievre campaign basically shut him out, I think that's probably why there was
more so. They were very careful. This is before even the annexation threats. The 51st state rhetoric started. There was zero official contact between the Conservatives and the Trump administration, which was somewhat unusual. Even in, after a presidential election, after a new president comes in, you'll usually have the official opposition in Canada, have reach out in some capacity. So way back in the 1980s, Brian Mulroney, when he was leader of the opposition, he actually went to Washington for sit-down meetings with Ronald Reagan. So the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre were very careful of having no contact whatever, no phone calls, no known phone calls, no letters, no meetings, nothing, just an absolute wall of silence between the two, likely to avoid that association. As I mentioned, American analysis of these elections is that it wasn't so much about Pierre Poilievre's platform or domestic problems, obviously, or even the fact that he was rhetorically aligned with Donald Trump. As Trump said, Pierre Poilievre probably hated Trump more than Carney does. It's just the fact that he was associated with him by nature of being a right-wing politician, and Trump is also a right-wing politician. Was enough to lose him the election, apparently.
It's interesting, too, that Mark Carney and Donald Trump do have a connection, and it came out during the campaign, but not very broadly. It's largely independent media were talking about the fact that Jared Kushner received a very, very big loan from Brookfield Asset Management, probably about 15 years ago, because he had a property in New York City that was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Brookfield came through. And there seems to be a relationship between Donald Trump and Mark Carney that has not been fully evaluated or explained. So I think that's another reason for this. But I have to laugh when I see the Washington Post saying Carney owes his job to President Donald Trump. He has acknowledged that he would not be where he is had Trump not imposed steep tariffs on America's northern neighbor and repeatedly demanded that Canada become the 51st state. In January, the Liberal Party was down 23 points in the polls, but after Trump set the U.S.-Canada crisis in motion. And that to me is incredible that the liberal media is acknowledging this, but you're not really hearing this at all from the conservative media in the United States, and they're all blaming Pierre Poilievre. It's entirely Pierre Poilievre's fault, and especially the Canadian expatriates who are working as conservative journalists in the States. And I think of podcasters like Viva Frei, but even the founder of Rumble is saying the same thing. It's all Pierre Poilievre's fault. But the question I have is, unless
I would point out, my theory as to why that's happening is because the alternative is you have to accept that Donald Trump, for no apparent reason, swung an election for the Liberals. If you're trying to sort of, which I guess would be a black mark against MAGA and the Trump administration. So, if you're trying to find reasons not to accept that, of course you would blame Poilievre. So, that is my interpretation of people blaming Poilievre, because as conservative campaigns go, that was essentially a perfect campaign. You can argue the rhetoric wasn't there. There's any number of reasons, why he wasn't clicking with certain groups. But under conventional circumstances, that is as good as conservative campaigns get, without John Diefenbaker in the picture. I would say it's entirely the intervention of Donald Trump, which made it a loser. Because again, he got 41%. That's the highest any conservative has gotten since Brian Mulroney in the 1980s. It's higher than anything Justin Trudeau ever got, anything Jean Chrétien ever got. It's a very high vote total, but the Liberal vote total was higher because of the anti-Trump vote.
My personal opinion is that Donald Trump did this because he does want to destroy the Canadian identity. He wants to destroy woke Canada, and he'll do it in whatever way he can. And he sees this as the way because he sees the Alberta separatism on the rise. And as soon as that happens, of course, it's the inevitable destruction of the country. But unless the goal is the outright destruction of Canada, is Mark Carney in the best interest of Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans, whose goals are diametrically opposed to Carney's?
Oh, I don't want to bring up Molotov-Ribbentrop or whatever, but I do think I've heard the argument. I've heard the argument that Trump excels when he's sort of yelling at a sort of European-aligned technocrat. This is someone that, although they agree on very little, maybe they get along better than a sort of fellow conservative who hates him and has similarly bulldog tendencies. So I would compare it to we have this idea. Your average police officer is much more similar to your average criminal that I think we're comfortable with. They're not opposites. They came from the same neighborhood, similar background. The police officer went this direction and the criminal went in this direction. So although ideologically speaking, they are different, I think, Mark Carney is certainly much more a similar politician to Trump than I think many Canadians are willing to acknowledge. I often think what a Canadian Trump would look like, because every country has their own unique Trump. Trump is a uniquely American figure. And if any country if they're going to have a Trump, he's not going to look like Trump. You'll have French Trump, you'll have British Trump. It's going to be slightly different. And, I would argue that Carney is probably as close to a Canadian Trump as you get. He's our sort of, a lot of our sort of base instincts, distilled into one figure. And for that reason, although their platforms are different, they may get along better than we assume. Because again, he's one of the only senior liberals I can think of who Trump has been very polite to. He hasn't had a nickname for him. He hasn't, barraged him with insults after every time they speak. And that's Chrystia Freeland, Justin Trudeau, anybody he's had any contact with. There's just been, a stream of insults afterwards, and that has not happened with Carney. So he's made it very clear that he prefers Carney. That's
a fascinating observation. Very, very perspicacious, because you're right. He has a nickname for everybody else, and he hasn't done that for Mark Carney, although that would probably be easy. Could be Little Carney because he's Trump towers over him. But running against Donald Trump, even more than Pierre Poilievre, it's a fairly old strategy for the Liberal Party, running against the U.S. instead of the Conservatives. And it works very well in the past. But why do you think so many Canadians fell for this election cycle?
I don't know. I mean, one thing that I sort of encountered, and one thing I react against often is just the number of Canadians who, they watch CNN, they consume U.S. media. And I find we're sort of in a unique situation among sort of, second-tier nations, is that our populace often is not sort of dialed into a lot of the problems that actually face this country. So this is something that came up often during the Trudeau government, in which they would hammer hard on an issue because they knew it would play well among people who watch too much politics, U.S. politics, but made no sense in a Canadian context. So I'll give the example of gun bans. I mean, they're pursuing these gun bans because, they're assuming if someone's consuming way too much U.S. politics, they'll say, well, finally, someone's dealing with all this gun violence. And these played well among the U.S. I mean, Trudeau would put out some tweet about getting rid of the guns, and it'd be picked up by CNN, and he'd be getting all this attention, among Democratic circles. But you're talking about a very different regime with guns in Canada, and often they made absolutely zero sense. And the problems we have with screening and with guns, it's very different than it is in the U.S. You find this with abortion as well. Just the fact that the Liberals could hammer on the abortion issue time after time after time, and people would apparently fall for it. Abortion has not been a major political issue in Canada since the 1980s, to the point where, Pierre Poilievre is adopted. If he was an American politician, he would probably have some kind of public pro-life position. And consistently, ever since the Conservative leadership, going back years and years and years, whenever anybody mentioned the A word, he just immediately said to Pierre Poilievre, he said what Harper would say, Pierre Poilievre government will not make we aren't going to touch abortion with a 10-foot pole. That's the last thing I want to do. So the fact that the Liberals could just keep bringing up an issue that has not been relevant throughout my entire lifetime, it can only be explained by the fact that we have a substantial, possibly plurality of voters who are more dialed in to the politics of a foreign country than their own, and often think those politics apply to them. To bring up a cop reference again, ask how many police officers, when they're arresting someone, are told that they have to read the suspect their Miranda rights, because this is law in the U.S., it's not law in Canada. So I would attribute it to the fact that we often confuse the United States with ourselves and make political decisions on that basis.
Interesting observation about abortion. Yeah, exactly, because they use that time and time again, even though Poilievre seems to think, even though we have no abortion law at all in Canada, we're far to the left of any European country. He's afraid to even say, maybe we should have a law of some kind, because we have unrestricted abortion on demand right now. And perhaps the law would be in order. But no, you're right. He's afraid to do that because the Liberals take him to task every time and win that argument. Did you find there was an air of unreality surrounding this campaign, almost like echoes of 1984, with these hate sessions? If you've read the novel or seen the movie, they have those hate sessions in the theater where they're all going like this. And it was actually somebody else pointed out to me that it was like the elbows up. It was almost identical to the elbows up rage sessions these Liberals were having against the U.S. and against conservatives, and to the point where we had these insane boomers, basically these very elderly men, raging at these new media, threatening them, giving them the finger. And I thought it was just bizarre the way the Liberals used rage against conservatives and Trump and the U.S. like they were all part of the same cycle.
Yes, I would say the unreality for me, and this is sort of showing up in the voting numbers, is just the huge rift among what people thought this election was about. So I think, the numbers are clear. Carney was put over the top by just a crazy outsized over 60 vote. So just turned out for the Liberals in wild numbers, unlike anything we've probably seen in 40 years. And then when you look at poll breakdowns of why people were voting, for whatever party, among over 60, it's 51% or more. We got to get Donald Trump. We got to get back at Donald Trump. And then if you ask anybody under there, they'll say, well, remember, we were going to have an election about domestic problems. I can't afford a house. There's random stabbings every couple of days. There was a mentally ill guy who just drove a car into a bunch of people. There are serious systemic problems. Our GDP per capita is the lowest in the OECD. There are a lot of other problems we have to deal with. I'm upset about Trump too, but we should also have an election about these things that have been affecting us disproportionately because we don't own homes and whatever. So, I published a story in the National Post today showing that the immigrant vote also disproportionately went for the Conservatives, because if you showed up in Canada since 2011, just like young people, you've been exposed to the economic problems more than someone who maybe purchased their home in the 1980s and now have a clear title. So yes, it was surreal for me in that it exposed these sort of two Canadas, the Canada of people who have to ride the bus and are tired of inhaling meth smoke, you know, and have seen rent going up their entire lives. Just economically speaking, every single year of my adult life has seen, you know, a stagnation of the Canadian economy. It's seen, you know, especially over the last 10 years, it's seen crime getting worse. Just the fact that there is a large cohort of Canadians who have visibly seen the country declining and deteriorating. And then overnight, 3 tweets or Truth Social posts from Donald Trump could convince, you know, a bunch of Canadians who are not exposed to these problems that, oh, actually, we should have an entire election based on, you know, screwing over Donald Trump. And we'll get to this other stuff later. So that is the defining factor, because those people are not going away. One thing that really stood out to me was they did the high school straw poll of how this election was going to go. And it's got to be the first time in Canadian history, and possibly one of the first times in Western history, in which high schoolers were more conservative than the general populace. So it wasn't a blowout, but the high school vote, if we just let high schoolers vote, we would have had a conservative minority versus a liberal minority. So the fact that we have a country in which young people are turning to the conservatives consistently at higher rates to old people, because sometimes you'll have conservative waves among young people in tandem with old people. Like, you know, a bunch of young people voted for Margaret Thatcher, a bunch of old people voted for Margaret Thatcher. But the fact that your average Canadian 25-year-old is more likely to vote conservative now than your average 65-year-old liberal, that's like cats laying with dogs. Something is wrong. And I think it all goes back to the economy. You just, even if you earn a good wage, if you can find one of those, your ability to sort of buy a home and live a normal life is severely hindered. And you've seen it become severely hindered as a result of a policy decision over the last 10 years. And that's what this election was about to you. And you saw, you know, your neighbors, anybody with graying hair said, oh, actually, no, that doesn't matter. What matters is screwing over Donald Trump and, you know, doing this chicken dance.
I'm wondering about your thoughts on the Conservative campaign in general. I know many of the people who were running that campaign, and I have nothing but contempt for them. I thought they should not have come back after losing in 2015 with Stephen Harper. But I thought Poilievre finally got his stride about 3 weeks into the campaign when he stopped listening to some of his communications people and switched the narrative from Donald Trump is evil to change, because that's what Canadians needed to be reminded of. 10 years of devastating liberal government, a decade of drift, a decade of economic catastrophe. It seemed to take him far too long to get into change, and away from Trump. What do you think?
I do not envy anybody who worked in the Conservative campaign, because again, just for me watching it, the whole thing was baffling, because I thought, okay, we're going to have an election, you know, we're going to get these problems fixed, and just to see it, the agenda completely taken over by Trump, it confused me. So I have no idea what was actually going on in the Conservative backroom and how you would reorient to that. So I've heard the opposite argument. I mean, any number of people are saying, hey, if he'd hammered on Trump even harder, we would have voted for him, which I don't think is the case. But I think, yeah, he was caught between that. He had to differentiate himself. I mean, if you accept the argument that he lost purely because he looked like a Trumpian figure, you know, regardless of policy, if you just stood them next to each other, which one, you know, imagistically resembles Trump, I guess you would say Poilievre, and that's the reason he lost. It's not fair. So he's caught between, he's got to differentiate himself from Trump, someone he's actively attempted to have nothing to do with, mixed with, they had an existing campaign about how they were going to deal with all these existing problems. So I don't know, because if he, like you said, if this entire election had just been the change election, he would have been accused of not doing anything but Poilievre. So I'm inclined to sort of take a fatalist view of this. There's nothing he could have done, because the parameters were so weird for this election. and so hard to overcome.
Do you think he probably could and should have done more conservative podcasts? Because I know people like Patrick Bet-David tried 3 times to get Poilievre on his program. Of course, millions of people watch this, Canada and the US. They hung up on him 3 times. They just did not want to talk to him. I know I approached Pierre Poilievre. I've known Pierre Poilievre for 20 years, since he first was elected in Ottawa, and actually before that when he was in Calgary, and got no response, as so many other Canadian podcasters got, even those with, I think, legitimate journalistic credentials. He kept saying, no, we're not doing that, until almost the last week. Then he started appearing on very small shows, or what he saw as safe shows. You think it would have helped had he reached out? Because, as it's been pointed out to me, Donald Trump is great at the rallies. Pierre Poilievre proved to be good at the rallies, but Donald Trump worked damn hard, reaching out to every journalist he could possibly reach, going on every media appearance he could possibly go on, and it was effective. And I think that's the primary difference between Trump and Poilievre as politicians. Poilievre is afraid of certain media. He's afraid to be called too conservative, too right-wing. Whereas Donald Trump will go on anything. He's not afraid to go to tackle the liberal media, and he certainly will go on any conservative podcast. And he knows he can't be overexposed during the election. And I think Poilievre was far too hesitant to reach out to not just the mainstream media, which of course he totally ignored, but the friendly media out there, the new media, the independent media, that is basically its own world and dynamic today.
I've heard the argument about mainstream media, that he should have done more mainstream media, which again he totally shut out. I was speaking to someone who was probably conservative aligned, and he said it reminded him of Harper. We forget in the last days of Harper, he basically avoided the press entirely. He would go on a tour and just sort of control access to one particular appearance. Wasn't really giving freewheeling press conferences. Wasn't allowing his MPs to speak. And that's also something that came up during this election. A lot of conservative candidates were not allowed to attend local debates, make local appearances, make local media appearances. So I think, that this phenomenon sort of cropped up even here on Vancouver Island, where they'd have an all candidates debate and everybody would be there except the conservative. And it's not because this conservative candidate couldn't have been a good debater and swayed people in the room. They just, it's better if we just avoid that and hope people vote conservative because of what they're seeing on their TV about what Poilievre is doing. So I'm inclined towards that argument because this was an election in which, if you're scared of people thinking you're going to be a conservative, this was an election in which I think Canadians were hungry for small c and even big C conservative ideas. So this more than almost any other of my lifetime, this was where you could go to a room of sort of on the fence voters, and the conservative would have points that the other parties weren't able to make, and they could sway people who are not typically conservative. This election saw a lot of people who are not typically conservative go to the conservatives just because reality had forced them into that position. So yes, I'm going to have to agree that doing less media was actually to their detriment, because I think the more people saw the conservatives, the more they liked them. Which they're going on old playbooks in which maybe that wasn't the case, but it is the case now.
I have to ask you, you're from Vancouver Island?
Yeah, I was born in Victoria General Hospital.
Oh, okay. I'm from Comox.
Oh, my mom is actually from the Comox area. She grew up in Camp 5. So that was for a brief period of time, was the world's largest logging camp. So she was about 6 years old when they dismantled it, and then she grew up in Courtenay.
Yeah, and that's my hometown. I spent 6 years as a public affairs officer at Comox 19 Wing, and it's nice to hear, Tristan. Anyway, get back to it's nice to meet people from my home. Where do you think we're going from here? I couldn't believe that Mark Carney has embraced Elizabeth May and that she has illusions about being the Speaker of the House. Now, she's quite welcome to run, but I personally cannot see anything more than 15 MPs voting for her. But do you think Carney can put together, because he said this morning or last night, he's ruled out a formal coalition or any sort of loose coalition as they had with Jagmeet Singh with the NDP. Do you think he could possibly collect a few more NDP MPs who would defect from the party so he can put together a majority government?
Maybe. I mean, I certainly no one has ever lost any political. You know, I think the Liberals would do well never to underestimate, you know, how much they can sell out and manipulate the NDP. I think that the last few years have shown that. So I'd certainly try. You know, offer any number of baubles and sort of positions and titles, or just a trophy. You know, here's your trophy for crossing the floor. But I don't know if it'll work. I mean, it is fundamental to NDP ideology. I was actually at NDP HQ last night, on Monday night for the election. And you'd think, I mean, I was told by my editors, go write the sad NDP story. And they're, you know, going to be sad. They're going to trudge out afterward. And a normal party would have done that if you suffer the worst defeat in the history of your party. Yeah, it's tears, it's silence. It's as soon as the speech is over, you're going home to drink. But the NDP did not do that because they're used to losing, and they thought, well, you know what? It's not that bad because we could still hold the balance of power, and we actually got a lot of our agenda done in the last few years. This is reasons. That's not a normal way to think. So the point I'm trying to make here is the people who join the NDP and become NDP MPs and have been NDP MPs for quite some number of years. They're not the same as Liberal MPs. You became a Liberal MP because maybe you're a well-known name and you enjoy holding and wielding power. You became an NDP MP for very specific ideological reasons, and you were never particularly interested in power because you knew you were never going to be on the government benches. So you can't, I mean, you can sort of manipulate the NDP, as we saw with the basically 8 years of the Trudeau government. But you can't attract them with power and the other things that would work on a conventional politician. So I would certainly try, but I don't know if it's going to work.
So you don't think Jagmeet is deep six the NDP, that there's still life in this party?
Yes, just because they again, a normal party who, you know, intends to sort of, you know, capture the government and hold power would say, well, this is obviously broken, we're going to do something else. So they don't necessarily, they almost see it as, there are elements of the NDP who see it as virtuous to occasionally suffer massive defeats. I mean, Jagmeet was framing it as, well, we kept the Conservatives out and we were able to get a dental care plan, and that was worth almost destroying the party. And that is much more of a popular view among the NDP than any other normal Canadian political party, except maybe the Greens. They're slightly nuttier.
Well, that's, yeah, I would tend to agree with you that they will go down until they get one seat, and that's probably what might happen. But I do think they will get a couple of defectors here but we'll see what happens. The other issue before we get to your book, Alberta separatism. I have never seen, and like I say, I grew up in Western Canada. I remember waves of Western separation sentiment, but I've never seen it this high. I know it's not really applicable to Saskatchewan and British Columbia, but in Alberta, I have never seen it this high, and I've never seen so many groups out there fighting for it at the same time, and so many of them talking like it's already a fait accompli. It's already happened.
We've already
and do you think it's actually a viable possibility right now?
There's certainly no reason not to think that, but I do think Albertans have a tendency to overestimate, you know, how much of the province is actually on board with things like this. So I'll often have people, you know, as someone from Vancouver Island, they'll criticize me as being, you know, surrounded by nutbags and greenies. But I'll point out that, any number of sort of nutty things that happen here in BC, there is sort of an equivalent, usually around the Edmonton area. So Alberta has no shortage of people who are, center or to the left. Obviously, it's a very conservative province. But I do think, if it's put to a vote, you have to get under the Clarity Act. We're one of the world's only countries that has a roadmap as to how a piece of the country could legally secede, and you have to get a clear majority. So I don't know, because separation sentiment was very high in Quebec, and they couldn't get that 50% at the height of sort of separatist feeling in the 1990s. So I do think, even if it's high, and it can seem very high, because say it's 30% of Albertans want to separate. That would seem very high. That's whole communities that are separatists. That's whole industries that would be separatist. That's a large part of your social circle that could be separatist, but that's still just 30%, and you need at least 50%. So I would point actually to the last election, people that couldn't believe that the polls showed the Liberals ahead, because the enthusiasm around Pierre Poilievre was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. And that was correct. The enthusiasm for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives was unlike anything that had happened within the last 20 years. But it was just higher among the Liberals. I would ask people to remind themselves that for every vocal Alberta separatist with a bumper sticker, there's probably 2 or 3 I would like to stay in Canada who maybe aren't as vocal about it. So yes, I acknowledge what you say. Alberta separatist sentiment is high, but not 50% high.
Yes, well, we'll see. I just interviewed a guy yesterday. It's almost like it's over. It's done. Let's get on with it. And
it's very hard to separate. This is something I hear from separatists a lot. They're like, oh, well, it's a referendum, and then you hire some guy to print the money, and bada bing, bada boom, we've created a country. Look up how countries are typically created, and Canada was one of the easiest countries to create, and it was a real pain in the butt to do it in 1867. So, read up on some history. There's a lot of homework you got to do in this particular thing. Good luck, but you do it correctly.
Yeah. Well, we will see. The dynamics of politics in Canada are just incredible right now. So I think anything can happen. But before I get to your book, I just want to say, first reading, it reminds me of the tone and assertiveness of the original National Post, which I remember. I was a staffer on Parliament Hill when that exploded. It literally, well, not literally, but it exploded on the political scene because there was nothing else out there reflecting small c conservative values or opinion at the time. It was totally dominated. And I've interviewed Conrad Black several times, and he was running that paper on a very personal basis. But I find first reading reminds me of the same tone and the same fun the National Post used to have.
It's fun. The fun has always attracted me to the National Post. So I remember I was just a little kid when National Post started showing up to the house, and that's what I remember is that from just boring Globe and Mail headlines and local blah 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 blah. Even at a young age, the first National Post I read, I was 10 years old. I was like, oh, this is actually kind of a fun, interesting newspaper. So that's always what's attracted to me towards it. And then they brainwashed me with all the conservatism, successfully.
So your book is Don't Be Canada. I think this is eagerly awaited. Tell me about it. What's the premise? What's the thesis? And what's it telling us about Canada?
It's self-explanatory, but this was written from my observation as a National Post reporter, that the ways in which Canada was sort of spoken about in foreign countries was changing. So one thing I do with the National Post is I'll just plug in the words Canada and Canadian and just do a Google News search for foreign media of how they're talking about Canada. It's a good way to find stories that maybe haven't gotten traction here. And within the last 5 years, it was me starting to notice doing these searches that Canada was starting to show up often as a warning of what not to do. And it used to be the opposite. It used to be if Canada is being referenced as an example It's if you want to get out of a sovereign debt crisis, what Canada did in the 1990s is the absolute, gold standard of what to do. If you want to run an immigration system, high immigration country without, mainstream anti-immigration pushback, do the Canadian points-based immigration system. If you want to get through the Great Recession in 2008, with minimal consequences, do what Canada did. So it was realizing that foreigners' view of Canada had shifted from that to Canada is the example of what not to do. So we saw this with the online harms bill. This was tabled by the Trudeau government, and this was our proposal to give life sentences for speech crimes and to give police the powers to detain people on suspicion that they would potentially say something hateful. And this got huge play in all throughout Europe, which is unusual because the Europeans love controlling speech. They don't have a First Amendment. They treat speech very differently than, maybe say sort of an American tradition. And even among places that are all about banning hate speech, Canada sort of stood out as an outlier. And a tabled piece of Canadian legislation was front page news all across Europe and the UK. You see it with assisted suicide, where this was often brought up. This one particularly, from the left to the right of the foreign media, the Canadian MAiD system has been cited as an example of what not to do. Or even any number of sort of just local scandals. The shop teacher who showed up with the just absolute massive fake prosthetic breasts. I mean, that was an international news story. I would be inclined to say there are tens of millions of people who all they know about Canada is our flag and the fact that we had a teacher with a giant prosthetic breast show up as a shop teacher. So it's that paired with the fact that this book is about how Canada, on a number of metrics, is not just doing poorly, but is doing more poorly than anyone else on earth. We have gone more extreme in certain policies, and we've suffered the worst consequences of those policies, which I think is surprising to a lot of Canadians. And it's surprising to me. I always thought if we're decriminalizing drugs and opening up, safe supply sites on every street corner, most mid-sized, even small Canadian cities have multiple safe consumption sites. If we're doing it, then, this is something that's probably happened in, a lot of liberal states in the US and, Scandinavia. And it's noticing that even Scandinavia is looking at our drug and medical policies, our criminal justice policies, and saying the Canadians are a bit too far for our liking. So there's 8 chapters, and it goes in everything from gender ID to criminal justice to the anti-racism system within Canada. And it only got a chapter in the book if I could prove that Canada was uniquely extreme in something. So there was something we were doing that no one else was doing. So one example, in the medical system, plenty of people have socialized medicine. Canada is the only place, except maybe Cuba, in which private insurance is banned. It's illegal for a procedure that is covered under the Canada Health Act. So if you just want to get private health insurance, so you're having a baby, rather than go through the public system, you'd like to use your insurance to maybe go to a higher level facility. This is very standard in Germany, Japan, Australia, all these other places that also take massive pride in Medicare systems. But Canada, it is banned. And that is sort of the root of many of our shortages, and why our shortages are, more systemically a problem than they would be in other places with socialized medicine. Another example, our MAiD system. About 13 countries have some version of doctor-assisted suicide. Canada is the only one in which doctors and nurses are told to recommend MAiD, not recommend it, but to tell patients that this is a potential option for them. So this is why you're getting all these scandals in which someone goes in with chronic illness, they don't have a terminal illness, a doctor comes in to discuss treatment options, and they say, oh, just so you know, you could kill yourself. And that dramatically changes the patient-doctor relationship overnight. That's illegal in a place like Australia, which also has some limited version of this. In Canada, it is part of the recommended guidelines. We treat it as a procedure, a treatment, versus that's well beyond the pale in Belgium, the Netherlands, any other place with this system. It's, treated as a civil right, but something that should exist beyond the medical system. So the book is just filled with that. The reasons why Canada, why it's a shop teacher in Canada showing up with the giant breasts and not getting fired, why that's happening in Canada and nowhere else. And there are policy reasons for all of these.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the online harms bill, because I don't know how many times I did interviews with European outlets who were shocked that Canada was doing this. But and if Carney resurrects this bill, which he hinted he would do during the campaign, it is the most onerous and draconian anti-free speech bill in the world in terms of democracies.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And it's also written quite broadly. A theme that comes up in this book is that a lot of our most damaging legislation. So if you're looking at, on criminal justice reform, why are people randomly being stabbed every couple days in Canada? And this is something that didn't happen. So a lot of what I was doing is I'm trying to trace the origins of these bad ideas. Well, this was part of a piece of legislation, which was, this Supreme Court decision, blah, 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 blah. And it's surprising how often we have a major national problem that was caused by a piece of legislation that was not seen as controversial at the time. MAiD being an example. I mean, there was some controversy, but knowing what we know now, and you're going back to the debate over MAiD, how few voices there were saying that, you could get into a situation in which you have doctors who are abusing their power. You could have a Veterans Affairs person who is recommending that veterans kill themselves. Just no curiosity, no idea to imagine the unintended consequences of these things. So I would point to, yes, it would be very broad, the online harms bill, but also we have a track record of putting in legislation that sounds nice and immediately goes too far, because those checks are not in place. It's broadly written, and you can have a bad actor within the system. Just take it in, run with it.
Oh, the medical assistance in dying bill, I think, is emblematic of the saying slippery slope, because it is getting progressively worse. And when you start talking about addicts, alcoholics being subject to it, it's insane. That's one of the things I thought Poilievre should have brought up, because Canada has become the suicide capital of the world. Yes. Under MAiD. We really have. And not a peep from Poilievre about possibly drawing this back. He just didn't want to go there. And I've heard that criticism about anything that was not fiscal or economic. Poilievre didn't want to touch. And I think that was a horrible thing, because
he was more so. I mean, at your standard, like going back to Aaron O'Toole, Andrew Scheer, even Harper to an extent. They're only comfortable talking about fiscal issues. But I mean, something I bring up often. I'm in Vancouver Island. So whenever someone around here has some dark right-wing thought in the middle of the night, they get in touch with me, their National Post friend. And it's never about the issues that the Conservative Party talk about, with some exceptions for Poilievre in this instance. It's always, why did I see someone wearing a niqab on the bus? Why did I go to the change room and there was in the women's change room, and there's someone who's clearly male changing in that particular change room. I brought it up and they said their gender ID policy allows it. It's always something on sort of, the social conservatism. It's always sort of a social issue, which, again, there was exceptions. There were sort of ways in which Poilievre tried to talk about it, but not to the extent, I think. I mean, we see the polls, the National Post Commission's polls. These are very important issues for some people. I mean, I can think of any number of women who voted Conservative for the first time and possibly last time in their entire lives, purely on the issue of gender ID, males in women's sports, etc. So the issues that could really get people out to the polls, because these types of issues are very motivating, weren't really touched by the Conservatives very hard.
So that's Don't Be Canada. From what you're saying, I would describe it as Canada is in the news, the international news, for all the wrong reasons.
It's a service we're providing, because we did all these horrible ideas and now no one else has to do it. So I would urge foreigners to buy this book as well.
Excellent. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And I don't want to keep you any longer. I know it's still early there, but you must be beat. And thank you so much for joining us. And I hope we can do this again. And all success to your book. We're going to have the information about it in our description, and we'll certainly promote it as much as possible. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Krayden.
And we'll see you again. Bye for now. That was Tristan Hopper, editor of First Reading and author of Don't Be Canada and the National Post columnist, as I've been at times. Thanks for joining me today, folks. This has been a real pleasure. I don't want to stay on the air much longer because we get to the end of our YouTube cycle. Thank you so much. And let's continue to resolve to resist. God bless Canada. Godspeed all of you. And I'll be back again tomorrow with more of the news you need to know. Bye for now.